I'll start a little before I found out I was pregnant with Lilly. Um, Before her, I had six miscarriages. Um, and when we found out we were pregnant with her, we went and got a miscarriage panel done. I was told that I have a blood clotting disorder, and they finally found out why I was miscarrying, so they had me on medication to make sure that she's healthy and I carried a term. Throughout the pregnancy, she wasn't growing as quickly as she's supposed to. She was always on the small side, to the point where even when she was born, she was 4 pounds, 4 ounces in the 0 percentile at 36 weeks, which is still really small. Um, at first, they said everything else was fine. She was healthy. They actually induced me because I ended up with atypical preeclampsia. My blood pressure was crazy, and so they ended up inducing me, and then she was born a month and a half early. Instead of May, she was born in March. Um, they kept us just overnight. The next day, they sent us home. Her temperature was low. Yeah. It was a military base too, so they weren't even equipped to handle preemies, but they sent us home after one night. And the next morning, I went to the restroom, and while I was in there, she was crying. So her little brother, or big brother, he was two, he picked her up and he tried to bring her to me, and he tripped and he fell with her. So he dropped her, and we went we went to the hospital right away, and they told us that she was fine. They did a CT scan, her head, or sorry, an MRI. Her head was fine, everything was great, but her temperature kept dropping. I believe when we got there, it was like 94.6, and we were there for several hours. And then at one point, I heard the doctor outside my door arguing with another doctor. She wanted to send us home, and this doctor happened to pick up the chart, and he's like, "Why would you send her home? Her temperature is dropping. It's down to 93.7, and um, there's no way we can handle a preemie here. We're not equipped to. We don't have a preemie ward. She needs to go to a different hospital." While they were arguing outside the door, I actually just opened the door and I was like, "Hey, look, I'm going to put her in the car and take her to a hospital. Don't worry about it." And the guy was like, "No, we're going to put you in an ambulance and we'll get you to the hospital that way." Well, I agreed, but on the ambulance, she stopped breathing. Um, the next thing I know, they're putting like a tube in her head, a tube down her nose, and a, like a tube or a needle up her back, and they're cutting off her clothes, and they wheeled her into the emergency room at another hospital, and I was basically pushed to the side. Um, it was crazy. I had no idea what was going on. Like, my baby was fine. One minute they're going to send me home, and now the next this is happening. My anxiety was through the roof. My husband couldn't get a hold of us. He had no idea what was happening. Um, and she looked like a different baby. By the time I got to her bedside again, she looked like a completely different child. Her whole body was swollen. She was red. Her eyes were so poofy around her eyes that you could barely see the slits of her eyes. And she was moved to the PICU. So, like a baby like Lily, when she's born, the minute a baby goes home, they're no longer clean. That's what they call them. They call them dirty babies. So when you go back to the hospital, you can't put them in the NICU. They put her in the PICU, and for the first few days, they were monitoring her, looking for any kind of infection. They couldn't find anything. They ended up giving her fortified milk. I remember that much. And her stomach one night when I was changing her just looked really big. And I barely touched her, and then out came blood with the fecal matter, and it was really scary. I was like, okay, this isn't normal. The nurses come back in, they take her for an x-ray, and they find out that her bowels were swollen and had necrotic tissue, and I had no idea what necrotizing enterocolitis was back then. But they ended up saying that they had to move her to the NICU. They made an exception for her, and they put her back into the NICU and put her in isolation. And from that point on, they started resting her bowels. So no milk, no nothing at all, except for the TPN. I think that's what it's called, the drip that she gets. And they told me that I could pick to either be with her or to go home with my family, because they couldn't have anyone coming and going because she was isolated. So I chose to stay with her. My husband was going to take care of the boys at home. It was hectic and crazy. My son was only 2, and he was just like, why did mommy leave? Where's mommy? And he wasn't understanding what was going on. But Lily kept getting worse and worse. And at one point, she contracted MRSA. And it was in the blood. She went septic. Her organs started failing. The doctors even asked me and the nurses if I wanted a priest to come read her final rites. And I fell apart. I was just like, what are you saying to me? This is crazy. She's fine. She cries. And no, I don't want him. He can leave. And I was shocked. I was floored. I told my husband what they'd said, and he came to see me and to see the baby, but they wouldn't even let him in. They were like, your wife can come out to you, but then you have to do this scrubbing, like scrub in, scrub out. And so he ended up leaving. But I remember one time, so they were doing spinal taps on her a lot. And it always breaks my heart. They don't let the parents in there when that's happening. You have to stand outside or sit outside somewhere and wait for it to be done. It would always break my heart when she would just scream that one scream that fades into nothing because she's just still going for so long. But the day she didn't scream, that was way more heartbreaking. It's like she didn't have the energy to scream. She didn't have any life left in her. They would pick up her arm and it would drop back down. She wasn't responsive at all. And I remember thinking that, like, that's it. They were right. She's not going to make it. But then, so I went to sleep. When I woke up the next day, the machines were off. She was gone. The lights were out, and I freaked out. I was running down the hall like a crazy person, screaming for my daughter. But it turned out that she had gotten a bit better, and they'd moved her to another room. They were still worried because the MRSA she had was a strand they'd never seen before. So they had to bring in doctors from DC, actually, to take a look at her, to put together a formula that'll work eventually and monitor her cultures. The NEC was looking a little better. So they finally started to do the feeding slowly. It was with like an eye drop thing. Like they would just put some milk in there, and I was feeding her like I would a kitten. And she was so tiny. Slowly it went up. They finally found a antibiotic, well, it was 4, working together that actually helped with the MRSA as well. And then she started to come around. She was crying again, which was amazing. I think on day 28, they let us know that we could take her home. And thankfully, she had NEC too, which meant if her brother hadn't dropped her, it would have gotten worse. They told us that she wouldn't have made it. They told us the next day we would have woken up and she would have been gone, especially because she stopped breathing. Yeah, it was crazy because you're so conflicted about it. It's like, okay, he dropped her. He shouldn't have been holding her. You feel like a horrible parent, but if he hadn't have dropped her, we would have never noticed. And she would be gone. just like that. She would have stopped breathing and we would have never noticed. So it was crazy. They're not even sure. They were surprised because normally when kids get NEC, they're a lot smaller. They're born a lot smaller, but she was bigger, well, older. She was really tiny. So we have no idea. Fortified milk, like they gave her fortified milk, and I didn't even know they were going to give it to her because she was on breast milk only. And yeah, the next thing I know, They're talking about she needs fortified milk, and I had no idea what that was. I didn't even have the chance to research it. It's something, I want to say it's even cow-based, and a lot of people worry nowadays that that's actually what caused a lot of neck for people, for children. But yeah, she still has stool issues. She will have constipation for weeks sometimes. She won't go. She's 7. Well, she'll be 7 in March. I'm hoping that she doesn't have too much of a long-term effect, but I just somebody the other day in their late 20s and they still have issues with their stomach. Honestly, when it came across my feed the other day, I was rereading it and there was so many little details that I'd added to the story that I didn't remember, and it made me emotional all over again. We went from a rocky pregnancy, not knowing if we were going to be able to keep her, to jump right into something that I had never heard of, necrotizing enterocolitis, and I started Googling it, and that was a really bad decision. Let me tell you. The survival rates, and then the other infections that come with the long-term care, all the surgeries, and on top of that, doctors telling me, "Oh, she's not going to make it. Don't hold out your hope." And I'm like, "What do you mean, don't hold on to hope? Like, how can you tell somebody that they're about to lose their child when you're not even sure?" On one hand, you tell me she's got 20% chance to live. Then it goes down to 3 because of the MRSA. And I just, kept my faith in God. I mean, God in medicine, but God. And she was strong. She's a fighter. She's still really feisty. Hopefully they caught it early enough to catch it before she needed surgery, which is another blessing in disguise that her brother dropped her. It was a close call. She loves to tell the story herself. She'll sit there and tell her friends that she's a miracle baby. She really is.